Greetings, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a rainy day. I was just talking to a friend there who was wondering, if she could hang her jacket in the closet. And I hadn't really thought about closets in a while because I haven't needed one, but it is actually getting cold. It's like we have to begin remembering the seasons are changing. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation. We're streaming live on lots of blogs, the Palestine Note, the Washington Note, the American Strategist website, in a program today that New America Foundation is proud to sponsor with the Tomorrow's Youth Organization and the Palestine Note. I am one, as many of you know, I put myself up here to moderate and help facilitate a discussion, but I need to put my cards on the table. I don't do many events that have focused on women's issues, let's just be honest. We should have done more in this field, but it's an area that I don't feel particularly comfortable. It's an area that I often feel like I don't have the equities that many other speakers have on what is a really important issue, and particularly when you look in the Middle East. I just wrote an article that was trying to reflect upon the nature of debate, sometimes very nasty debates in the blogosphere, and said it's easy to read a transcript, but you can look horizontally, but you don't get the topographical picture. And if you look at women's issues in the Middle East, you need to look topographically, because in some places there are great gains, in some places they're in low valleys, in some places it's just completely flat, in some places all you see is into the abyss, and it is very different. And I think that it's easy for people like me who come at issues either in kind of, whether it's economic or foreign policy or national security issues, for us to get lost in cliches and generalizations that may or may not have any roots in reality. But I'm so happy today that with TYO and the Palestine Note, we have brought together an assembly of people to help us fill out our thinking and approach on a lot of these questions. And there is a week basically going on, one very big event last night that we enjoyed, and there's a giant dinner tomorrow night with President Clinton, former, I guess you would call her First Lady of Great Britain, Cherie Blair. I want to pay very good homage to my friend Hani Masri here, who's bringing in his friend Quincy Jones, and there's an effort to basically put a spotlight on not only an organization called Tomorrow's Youth Organization that does a lot of great work in Nablus, Palestine, but basically to focus on the broader agenda of issues. And I titled today's event Beyond Platitudes, Women's Economic Empowerment in the Middle East, because I think it's easy for DC types to talk at 30,000 feet. It's not really easy to have an informed discussion about what is real and what is not in this issue. So I'm very honored to be here with a fantastic panel of folks. And let me tell you who we have here. We have Nell Derek Debevoise, who is the executive director of Tomorrow's Youth Organization, works very closely with Hani Masri, and it's great to have her up here. She has folks that have participated in this program in the audience, and she may, in fact, point to them as we move on. We have to her left, Nadere Shamlu, Senior Advisor in the Office of the Chief Economist for Middle East and North Africa. She is really one of the really brilliant people who know the great granular detail economic trends, sort of the Alan Greenspan, if you will, in making, although that's not as good a title as it used to be. But I'm familiar with her work and a great fan. We have my colleague Amjad Attallah, who is the co-director here of the Middle East Task Force at the New America Foundation, a regular blogger, and he is co-founder. Oops, maybe I have this wrong. Are you co-founder for Women International? Yes. Who knew? Wow, I didn't know that. Yes. Neato. I should read up. Then we have Doha Taha Brahimi, a consultant and vice president with Grey Matter International, and she's been involved with all sorts of women's issues in the region, and I'm sure I have a bit more. Yes, I've got a long whole page for her. She is vice president of GMI, very involved with a number of nonprofit initiatives, including those linked to management efforts of Grey Matter International. I just in a completely bit of a tangent here, enjoyed spending some time with her father-in-law discussing the region, Lakhdar Brahimi, who is, in my book, one of the best deal makers and equilibrium achievers out there. He's somebody I have enormous time and respect for. And we have Fida Edeli, who is the Clovis and Hala Salam Maqsood Chair in Arab Studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. So we really have an outstanding group. I also want to pay respect to, where's Samia? Right in the front, yes. This is another lady that helped bring all of this together, asked her friends to participate, and I want to pay special respect to Samia Faruqi, who I will come in. She said, don't call on her because she will, if she has something to say or hit me with, she will not be shy about it. So we'll be back at that. But without further ado, let me invite Nell to help set the stage for what we'll do, about 7 or 8 minutes each. Come to the podium, and then we'll get through the presentations, and I look forward to an active discussion with the audience. Nell?
Thank you, Steve. It's exciting to be doing this. We've been talking about it for quite some time, so pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. Indeed, it's a big week for TYO. We're sort of coming out in Washington just 3 years after having been founded by Hani, who's here with us. So I have quite a micro perspective compared to some of you with a more theoretical or longer-lasting, broader-ranging background. Basically, Tomorrow's Youth is an American nonprofit. We were founded 3 years ago, and the original vision was to work in early childhood development. So providing non-formal education, arts and sports for young children, 4 to 8-year-olds from the refugee camps and sort of the worst off areas of the Middle East, beginning in Nablus, Palestine, which is a magnificent but very troubled city in the West Bank. The idea of giving all that was to offer psychosocial and mental health well-being for young kids who have grown up amongst such violence and poverty. They don't have the kind of mind-opening educational play that most kids can and should have. So we started doing that about 2.5 years ago and really reaching out to the refugee camps that we were targeting. And parents were thrilled, first of all, even as Americans, working obviously closely with Palestinian staff. Please, yes, we would love our kids to play. Every parent wants the best for their kids. It's universal. But quickly what they started saying, the moms would say, I have 8 kids with me here. So if you're going to take one of the young ones, that's lovely, but I still have 7. And I myself have been a maid and a babysitter and a house cleaner for my whole life since I was 14. So if you could do something for me, I really could do something more for all 8 of my children. And so we said, right, okay, that makes a lot of sense. That's a pretty compelling argument. So we said, well, what would you like? What would you like us to do? And one of the first things they came up with was exercise. They would like to do some aerobics and get some nutrition information. Again, pretty universal women's issue, if we will. And so we said, okay, we brought some American interns for that summer, and Christina, for example, and Maggie, 2 of them are in the audience. And they did Pilates and aerobics and yoga, and these women loved it. They took off their abayas and robes and sweat and shouted and worked out. So that was going really well, and of course that also helped them support our children's programs. But eventually they got more comfortable and they said, we'd like to learn English too. Our kids are learning English and we can't help them because we never studied. Or computers, the same thing. I said, right, we can teach English, we can do computers. So we started doing all of that. And then it was actually on one of Hani's visits over to Nablus that some of them said, okay, now we can type, we can use Excel a little bit, we know Google, but we're still really poor. I still can't put food on the table. So let me do something now. I have some skills and I certainly have the willingness to work. Right, okay. So Hani said, let's get these women jobs, let's get them working. Right, okay. So really fortunately at the Clinton Initiative up in New York in '08, I guess, we connected with Cherie Blair, who will be joining us shortly, and was launching her foundation to support SMEs, small, medium enterprises for women around the world. But obviously, given her husband Tony's involvement in the Middle East and just her own interest in the region, she was quite passionate about the West Bank and excited to work with us. So we started from there a program that we're now wrapping up the first-year pilot, promoting women in entrepreneurship. So we've actually gotten to the point where Hadil, who's also in the audience, and 9 other businesses are being incubated to launch. And they range from kind of a local hair salon in one of the refugee camps to Hadil's incredible idea for work placements and international internships for Palestinian students, to the first recycling plant in the West Bank. Just really cool stuff, and all created by these women, these young women. So anyway, bit of background, and what we've kind of learned from that I wanted to share with you today are that 2 things. Basically that the programs, to really work, there's a lot of buzz about economic development and entrepreneurship, which is great. I think it's a good idea. But I also think we have to be careful because it can also be a bit of a Band-Aid that doesn't really work. So two things. I would say that our programs are really comprehensive, first of all, and that's on two levels. They're comprehensive for the individual, for the single person, and also looking at the broader system, the community in which women are embedded. And the second is that they need to be a bit innovative. You have to kind of push the envelope a little bit. So we're the first ones to say that we're in Nablus and we go out and we ask on the streets, so it's very locally based, but you still have to push people a little bit to make things better. So on the level, in terms of comprehensiveness, when we look at these individual women, again, we're dealing with our kids. It's great for a woman to work, but if you're going to bring her work, she has to do something with her children, both for the children's well-being and also to avoid that the husband or the family resent the fact that she's working, right? If she's all of a sudden neglecting her womanly duties of childcare, that's going to get some pushback from families. So by dealing with women also as mothers and as homemakers and wives, we can avoid that kind of conflict and say you really can do both. We also do, just basic health services, things like the nutrition and the aerobics, or awareness about other maternal health issues or pediatric health. And then also more general skills, confidence building, team building, and letting the women work together between the groups so that we have these 10 women. They're not competing. We have one woman who does flyers, for example. We say, why don't you make flyers for this other business? And then they give each other contracts right from the start. So this kind of individual, more holistic view, rather than just saying, give us a business plan and what are the revenue projections? It needs to be a bit more whole person approach. And then also just working with the whole system. So, we're in touch with the governorate of Nablus and the the German Development Agency, who's working with the governorate of Nablus on policy and on structural things, that the government is offering. They are in touch with us, and they look at us as a model that we can then scale up eventually through the Nablus area and then through the PA. Steve is giving me time of warning, so I'll stop just adding the last point about innovation. We do things like meetings in New York with the Hanky Panky lingerie company to help us design the products that the women are embroidering. One of the businesses is embroidery, traditional Palestinian embroidery on modern accessories and clothing. So we sit in the Mandarin in New York and sort of brainstorm what ideas they could come up with. Again, a little bit pushy for Nablus, but that's the kind of things we need if we're going to be really making sellable things. And then hopefully Cherie, when she gets here, can talk about what we're doing with mobile technology, which is another thing we're really excited about. So,
great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nell. Thank you. That was a great picture of that, and I look forward when Cherie Blair comes in to offer more comments. Now, we've had the micro. Now I'd like to go to the macro and ask, we're going to go keep everybody on edge by, I'm just going to jump around where I want, but have Professor Adeli join us.
It's funny that I should be characterized as the macro, because I guess that's expected of a professor. But in fact, my thoughts for today were about some of the limits of the macro and how the micro might inform a more nuanced macro perspective on women's economic development in the region.
Perfect.
And so I was asked to speak. Well, one of the things I was asked to speak about was benchmarks, or thinking about benchmarks for women's economic empowerment, what they ought to look like. And so I thought about, that I would just think about ways to push our imagination about what economic empowerment might look like. Although Nell, in speaking about exercise and nutrition, sort of has already taken us there in some respects in this kind of comprehensive, holistic approach. But one of the things I talk about often in my teaching and work on development is how what is easily measurable comes to define what we understand to be development and progress. And even though there's a lot of acknowledgement that much gets missed in this picture, we still, for the most part, what we can't measure remains peripheral to our vision of what development looks like, and what the barriers to development or economic empowerment might be. And so it limits, again, our imagination or our idea of what might empower women, or how women might even perceive their economic empowerment. And I think the best example is in the way in which we conceive of labor and economic participation. And this is regularly acknowledged when we try to think about economic development across the region for women. And the most obvious being the ways in which informal labor isn't as easily captured as formal labor. So we know a lot more about which women are in the formal labor force. We don't know enough about the informal labor force. Despite the fact that we understand that there's quite a bit going on informally or in spaces that are not as easily measurable, our measures of economic development and progress for women still heavily rely on what's more easily measurable in the formal participation. But yet some of the work that's tried to measure other kinds of economic activity points to the ways in which women's labor participation or economic activity is actually quite high, and in some instances much higher than men. And this is without even counting their domestic work. So if we look at some of the poorest countries in the region, a place like Yemen, even Morocco. So Yemen, for example, has officially the lowest labor force participation of women in the world, according to the most recent World Economic Forum. But a recent report about Yemen pointed to the fact that in both rural and urban areas, when we account for non-wage labor and sustenance kind of agricultural work, women work much more than men. And so there's this sort of disconnect between this kind of measure and that kind of measure. So there are obvious reasons why in the poorest countries women are actually working and have no choice about their labor. And it has a lot to do with the sort of day-to-day struggle of households for economic survival. So one of the things in terms of trying to connect the micro and the macro is to remember which women we're talking about and under what kinds of conditions they face. But it goes beyond even the question of the informal labor force participation, because it also goes to the kinds of non-income generating work that women do that are critical to the survival of the economic survival of their households. So I'm still not even talking about child care and care for the elderly, but the other kinds of day-to-day work that, again, for families who are most vulnerable is critical to the economic survival of the family. There's a really interesting, somewhat dated book about this that Homa Hudfar writes about low-income women in Cairo, but just the amazing amount of work that goes into household management and frugal shopping and producing things in the home that are less expensive if produced in the home versus buying in the store, and all the hours and hours of money-saving kinds of work that women put into the day-to-day management of the household, and how that's critical for the survival of families who are at the cusp, and even for families who are trying to move up a bit, who are trying to save every penny so that they can ensure that children can go to school and can get married, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's that kind of income, economic activity that's not income generating but is critical to the survival of families, which is part of what I think we need to better be able to capture in trying to measure women's economic empowerment. Now, all of this doesn't even get into what has been called women's reproductive labor, so the child care, the caring for the elderly. And for decades here in the U.S., even feminists and feminist economists have argued that there've got to be ways in which we have to account for this important work of raising children, taking care of the elderly, and the kind of domestic work that doesn't get captured in our calculations of labor force participation. And this is particularly the case in contexts where these services are not provided by the state or are not easily accessible, and when there's sort of no alternatives to women's labor in terms of providing care for children and the elderly and the range of other kinds of household work that needs to happen. So I just threw out a few examples here just to get us thinking about a broadened conceptualization of economic activity that points to other dimensions of women's economic security, and also how women might perceive their economic security and their economic development in ways that don't quite fit what we expect. Because in some contexts, again, particularly for the most vulnerable women, not having to work is actually a sign of progress. So for women who have to struggle day to day to help their family survive, if they can get to a certain level of economic security, the ability to sort of opt out for a period of time might actually serve as empowerment in their context, especially if what their alternatives are exploitive labor, are labor that keeps them away from their children when they don't have some place for their children to be, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in thinking about labor and economic development, there needs to be that kind of attention to sort of what are the options for women, under what conditions are they working. The other part of that equation, too, is thinking about the reliance on for wealthier women on domestic servants in the region and domestic labor, and the fact that we can't really think about economic development without incorporating the labor of these women who often work under very highly exploitive conditions. And then I guess just on a final note, in terms of the benchmark, and I have one more final note, in terms of the benchmarks and imagining this, is thinking about, and Nell also mentioned this, but thinking about women's families and communities as part of how they're conceptualizing economic security. So for women, the ability to provide their children with education, the ability to ensure that their children will live a better life is part of how they're conceptualizing their own economic empowerment, right? So what kind of sacrifices do I need to make in order for my child to stay in school, for example? But also the concerns women have about their own economic security in old age and how this is tied to the decision-making process about what's in their best interest. Again, in the absence of Social Security or other kinds of care for the elderly, this is an important consideration. And then in the context of going back to how much labor our women actually put in, how women assess choices about work based on this double burden, the amount of work that they have at home, and how they're trying to balance that with work outside of the home. The significance of all this for thinking about benchmarks for economic empowerment, I think, kind of comes back to what I started with, the issue of methods and how in many respects what we can easily measure comes to define economic empowerment for women. And that it's much harder to capture some of that nuance, especially if we're trying to talk about the region as a whole, even at the national level. It becomes much more difficult to get at sort of the day-to-day difficulties of women of different classes, women with different kinds of economic participation options. And so I guess the thought I want to sort of leave us with is how we can create more of a space for women to define, or women to define their own empowerment, and how we can use the kind of in-depth analysis that I referred to earlier, in which Hoodfar spent 2 years in this community of low-income women and really got a sense of how both decisions about marriage, education, different kinds of jobs, how women made these kinds of decisions based on extended family pressures, based on their own calculation of what was best for their children, based on their own desire for some leisure, or their own desire to stay closer to home as opposed to travel an hour to go to work, et cetera, et cetera. So thinking about how more qualitative, in-depth kind of research can inform what we think of as benchmarks for economic development in the region is the point that I would like to leave us with. Thank you. That was thought-provoking, absolutely perfect.
I want to thank Henrietta Kolb, the CEO of the Cherie Blair Foundation, for joining us, and guess who? Cherie Blair of the Cherie Blair Foundation for Women. Thank you very much for joining us here today, and we'll come back after the discussion. Let me now go to Nadaret Chamloo of World Bank to set some of the financial and economic context.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for comparing me to Alan Greenspan. I hope that one day we will all be sitting here and talking about irrational exuberance about women's participation in the labor force. But I think in the meantime, we have a few more years to go before we reach that level. I wanted to take the opportunity to be a little bit provocative, if you allow me to be like that. And I think I would like to expose you to some, I would say, new thinking or new evidence that has come out, and which in a way defies the old expectations we have had. But first, let me give you a little bit of maybe a 1 minute explanation about the journey that I have taken personally in understanding gender issues, and certainly in understanding women's economic empowerment in the Middle East and North Africa region. I came from a part of the bank where I was involved in oil and gas pipelines and telecom and so on, until somebody approached me and said, we really have a challenge in the MENA region, and why don't you come to MENA? You're a woman from the MENA region. You should understand gender issues. But, gender has a whole concept and the whole theory behind it. So I took on that challenge, and I think this is one of the most rewarding steps that I have taken. I started with writing a book on women's status in the Middle East, and very soon I realized that all of these old age type of thinking that, you educate the women, you educate or you reduce the fertility rate, that's going to lead to empowerment. That wasn't happening in the Middle East. Somehow there was a disconnect, and somehow there was a paradox that on the one hand, the region had achieved tremendous gains on education and health, but somehow that wasn't being translated into labor force participation or political participation. So then I started working a little bit more on why is it that women don't work? Maybe, and why is it that women cannot have more economic opportunity? And I was then very much inspired by this old discussion that, okay, the wife of the prophet was an entrepreneur, and there are no limits to entrepreneurship in MENA. And truly that is the case. And while everybody focuses quite a bit on microfinance, which is very important, extremely useful, extremely needed, many people forget or miss out on the much bigger opportunity and much bigger prevalence of female entrepreneurs in the MENA region, across the Middle East. Almost 1 out of every 8 or 7 firm in the Middle East is owned by a woman. The women-owned firms are almost as old, as sophisticated, as large, as everything as male-owned firms. And everyone comes and says, well, but they inherit the firm from their fathers. But fathers leave much more, or in terms of inheritance, to their sons than to their daughters. So we looked into this, and we found out that actually many of these firms were founded by the women themselves. They were managed by the women themselves. So there were quite a few issues that were defying the concepts that people have, that women are only there in name, but they're not, they're not managing, they don't have sophisticated firms. We found that actually women-owned firms had more foreign direct investment in them, more foreign partners. They exported more, and so on. And these were all, again, very much documented. But what I would like to discuss today are 3 issues that I think have come out of that journey and have led me to look at women's home-based work and entrepreneurship, because there is a prevalence of thinking that if women don't work outside, and the female labor force participation rate in the region is about 30%. They are inside the homes. They are working either informally, or they're having their own home-based work. So we embarked on a very, very large study, which is about to be coming. So I'm making a little sales pitch for my upcoming, but also my colleague's upcoming book. We looked at home-based work and entrepreneurship in 3 cities, because we wanted to leave out agriculture, and just 3 cities of Amman, Cairo, and Sana'a. So 3 different countries, large, small, big, rich countries. And we looked at, in each of the countries, for roughly 3,500 in Amman, 3,000 in Cairo, and 1,500 households in different income groups, because we said we want to cover everything. We want to cover, the rich, the poor, the middle class, and so on. And in every house, we went and we interviewed everybody: the mother, the grandmother, the mother-in-law, the child, the daughter, and everybody. So altogether, we have a survey of about a database of about 40,000 individuals, so one can do a lot of interesting things around it. And what we found was quite interesting, and I would like to share at least 3 of the findings with you. First of all, we found that women did participate in the labor market, and as expected, educated women participated in the labor market. So when everyone says, well, go ahead and get your university degree and to participate in the labor market, this is true. Women participated, and women participated at roughly the same rates as one would, for instance, expect in Europe or in some other countries. And also women participated at the low end of the education. So the uneducated and the educated participated. What was happening is that where we fall short in the region vis-a-vis other countries, and why is it that we have a 30% labor force participation rate rather than 40, 50, or 60%, is because the middle is not participating. Across the world, women with high school education participate in the labor market. Actually, they would be participating more in the labor market than, for instance, perhaps some of the more educated, because the educated women may be married to other educated men who may be doing very well, or they may be. But the middle class women, middle educated women participate in the labor market. And this is the group that is totally forgotten, because everybody will focus either on the top end of saying, we need to bring the university educated women to the labor market, which is very true, and it has to be like that. Or we focus on the very low end, which is about, microfinance and poverty and everything else, which is, again, very, very important. And this forgotten middle is just left there. And the reason why I'm raising this is because of the fact that we need to actually create new kinds of jobs for these groups. These are women who are intelligent, who are trained. I mean, high school education is a very, very high and fairly regulated level of education. So I would like to make a pitch for perhaps focusing a little bit more on this the forgotten middle. Then I would like to make one other point, is that why don't these women work? Is it because of the fact that they don't have the skills? No, they have the skills. They have the same skills as the men, but the men find jobs because, in fact, women do sometimes even, actually most often even better on these standardized tests. And there are standardized tests, and women do better in science, in verbal, and in math skills. And I would be very happy to share some of them with you. The common thinking is that women are held back because of children, because they have childcare and so on and so forth. Actually, this is not the case. And what we found is that women were held behind by marriage. The negative impact of marriage was far, far higher than the negative impact of children. So for some reason, the institution of marriage, the institution of this is holding back these women and not letting them work. Then we said, well, why should marriage be such an important factor? Because women marry everywhere in the world, and they still participate in the labor market. We dug a little bit further, and we found out that actually the percentage of men in the Middle East that are still opposed to their wives working is very high. Nearly 1 out of every 3 men is still opposing, under no condition that the woman should work outside. And the reason I'm raising this is because everybody focuses on the woman, that we need to ask, it's the woman that doesn't work, who doesn't want to work, and so on. But actually, it's the reverse. The women, it's maybe 1 out of every 10 women that doesn't still think that women should not be working, but it's 1 out of every 3 men. That's a very, very high rate. And when you look at the labor force participation rate in families where the husband thinks that the wife should work, it's about 25%, and in the households where at least 1%, and even one person doesn't think that the women should be working, it's down to 5%. So somehow we need to do something about the attitude of men vis-a-vis women working. Then we took one step further and we said, okay, let's look whether education has made an impact, because the region has invested a lot in education, and men and women have become fairly well. I mean, with some pockets here and there, but they're generally, the younger cohort is becoming better educated. And what we found was actually quite amazing, and this is why I was mentioning the exuberance that, maybe we still have a long way to go. We found that across the board, if men were against their wives working, it didn't matter which social class they came from, and it didn't matter how much education they had. But what was very interesting for us is that the younger generation was much more conservative than their fathers, even though the younger generation was married to, they had much higher education, and they were married to women who also had higher education. So in other words, the thinking that, okay, you educate the man and you educate the women and they become more open-minded and modern thinking, it doesn't seem to have happened. So there is, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I think that these 3 factors of we need to really work on the middle educated women. We really need to focus on the attitude of men vis-a-vis women's work, because I think, that is a major impediment. And the third thing is that somehow we need to address this issue through the education system, because somehow the education system today is producing more conservative people and more conservative people than it used to be a generation ago. And I think that with those three provocative thoughts, I leave you, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Adara, thank you very much. That was provocative. Let me invite Amjad Attallah to join us.
Well, thank you, Steve. I'm going to try to create a broader context for the conversation that we're having. While I was still serving as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team, Chairman Arafat decided to create a Palestinian Constitutional Committee. He did it because he was under pressure from the Bush administration, he was under pressure from the Saudi government, that he should pursue the creation of a constitution for a forever soon to be Palestinian state that everyone expected to be created. Now, I was a lawyer on borders and security, but I was asked to assist the Constitutional Committee because not much work was being done on borders and security at the time. And the first thing I wanted to do with the committee was take them to South Africa so that they could see how a constitutional process that had worked had taken place. Now, the committee was composed of 7 men, and I took the 7 men to South Africa. And the first meeting we had was with the Human Rights Committee, a committee that was composed of all races, all genders. And the woman who headed the committee addressed us, and the first thing she said to us was, "We welcome you to South Africa. We want you to know that it's only because of our loyalty to the cause of Palestinian freedom that we agreed to meet your committee, despite the fact that you've chosen to not represent half your population." This was actually very humbling for all of the very well-meaning men on the committee who never recovered, actually, from their embarrassment at that point. This, for me, was a microcosm of what's been wrong in much of the Middle East. Women have remained an afterthought in politics, in economics, and in religion, and at great cost not only to women, of course, but also to society as a whole. It's been difficult to modernize states. It's been difficult to stabilize states, or in the case of Palestine, to liberate a state, for a host of reasons. But probably one of them that has the greatest debilitating impact has been the unwillingness to incorporate women fully into the economic and political well-being of the nation state. Now, this is bad normally. I mean, this would be bad under normal circumstances. The conditions that you're describing, you might find resonance in other areas where there's poverty and where there's lack of development. The problem with the Middle East is much of it is still in conflict. As a matter of fact, I started listing the areas because we forget in the United States it's episodic. We tend to notice Iraq and then we forget about Iraq. We notice Afghanistan, forget Afghanistan, we go back to Palestine. If somebody's a pirate, we notice Somalia. But the truth of it is the Israeli-Arab conflict has had a direct impact on women in Palestine and Lebanon. Tomorrow's Youth works with people who are survivors of that. The Iraqi war with Iran in the 1980s, followed by the U.S. war with Iraq in 1991, resulted in tremendous dislocations, not only of Iraqis. 500,000 Palestinians were dislocated from Kuwait and other Gulf countries and never returned. The 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq resulted in another 4 million Iraqis displaced or made into refugees, which have created pressures in Jordan, Syria, Turkey, and elsewhere. Yemen has a civil strife taking place. Somalia has civil strife, is barely holding together as a state. And Sudan, in Darfur and in the south, has been a remarkable, has had horrific wars. Each of these conflicts, to varying degrees, the greatest impact have been on women and children. And I don't mean to lump those two together. Women, in fact, have been the ones who have done the most work in trying to hold the pieces together. To whatever extent societies have survived these conflicts, they have survived them not because of the men who've either gone to be fighters or to fight in the conflict or who have struggled in other ways, but it's been the women who've been responsible for trying to hold together the fabric of society. Now, as we've seen in so many cases, if you take away that glue, society has no chance of surviving. My first introduction to this, I mean, this has happened, of course, far back, but my introduction to this was during the Bosnia War when I first became involved on these issues. And the noticing how an army would specifically target a female population as a specific element of destroying the entire society. Now, in that sense, providing women with even a minimum of security and economic empowerment has a multiplier effect in promoting the rebuilding of society. You get a lot more bang for your buck helping one single woman than you do helping 10 men. Now, that's not you may have actually specific data to show how much that multiplier effect is. But its improvement in women's access to funds, both in small and medium-sized enterprises in particular, part of the work that you've been doing, has had such a powerful stabilizing effect that it remains a problem, in my opinion, that Western policy prescriptions don't have this as front and center of our development and aid policies. Now, under President Obama, the National Security Strategy has now focused on this, and the Presidential Directive on Development both have this in it, that they need to do this. But we haven't operationalized it yet. I accept that economic empowerment does not automatically lead to political empowerment, but it is necessary in and of itself, and for the benefit of the country in parallel with political empowerment. So the final thought I would have is that rather than remain a niche issue, this is going to have to become a cornerstone of our issues. We can't talk any longer about the conflicts that we're dealing with. We can't talk anymore about development. And we can't talk any longer about stability without having women's issues and women's economic empowerment being part and parcel of it, and women's political empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you, Amjad. Doa.
Good afternoon to all. I would like to start by thanking New America, Amjad, Atallah, and Steve Clemens in particular for organizing this event. I approach the set of issues before us as an Egyptian woman living in the United States, but active internationally and particularly in the Arab world. As a business person and as a concerned citizen active in civil society and development, and as a pragmatic engineer involved in crisis and emergency management. Notably, while tremendous challenges remain to be addressed in the Arab world, some promising new trends seem to be emerging. I will try to summarize here some points which I believe may contribute to tonight's debate. The situation in the Arab world continues to be characterized by suboptimal environment for women's socioeconomic development. But this varies greatly from one country to another and within each country. While we want to avoid reciting any platitudes, the hard data concerning women's challenges in the region should not be overlooked. Notably, the status of women reflects the overall status of socioeconomic and political development in the region. Poor governance and weak institutional capacity have been two limiting factors for socioeconomic development in many parts of the Arab world. For instance, in an area which I have been directly exposed to, that of the promotion of women's role in the economic sphere as relates to women's leadership in technology-based enterprise, many of the limiting factors are just the same as they would be in the Western world, only augmented by the state of institutional underdevelopment characteristic of the local environment. Challenges are mostly societal, even if they have political underpinnings, such as the lack of democracy and equitable treatment of individuals, and economic ramifications, of course. Moreover, even if it is very important for a woman to exercise a free, fair vote, it is even more important as a first step that she be able to exercise her civil rights equitably and with due recourse to the protection of justice and the rule of law, and this includes her economic rights. These are key obstacles for whole segments of population in the Arab world, including women, who have a seminal role in social stability, and these conditions are particularly severely impaired in extreme situations. Historically, women have often had a frontline role in major development in the Arab world, such as in the case of Algeria's War of Liberation. While this did lead to an initially progressive republic which protected in a quasi-secular form women's rights, the increasingly deteriorating political circumstances have led the regression exemplified by a family code relegating women to the role of minors and unraveling the hard-earned achievements of a whole generation of women and men freedom fighters. The jury is still out in a country like Algeria. One of the issues faced in the women's empowerment debate relate specifically to leadership roles. The examples are starting to abound of recognizing economic leaders, where mostly thought leaders existed before, but this remains the exceptions that confirm the rule. Lubna Ulayyan, Sheikha Lubna Al-Qasimi, and Maha Al-Ghunaim of Kuwait. Also, the pedigree of most of those leaders is mostly patrician and privileged, so the Arab world must do more to ensure access and upward mobility for its leaders, both male and female. It is also difficult to define the parameters of successful promotion of gender economic empowerment when the stereotypes abound of either the oppressed women of the people or the privileged upper-crust sophisticated jet-setting exception. These stereotypes, while often exaggerated by genuinely or purposely misinformed comments and provocation and counter-provocation often used by both fundamentalists and other actors in their jousting, are unfortunately sometimes accurate in the Arab world, where inharmonious development has tended to reduce the size of the middle class rather than expanding it, creating a situation of pauperization of the middle class, which has hampered women's development. Little girls and female youth education and training programs are critical to empowering women with the skill sets necessary to thrive economically. I happen to believe that even early childhood development programs are critical to allowing children in general, and little girls in particular, enhance their capacity at having an innovative and entrepreneurial outlook in life as they grow up. The Sherry Blair Foundation for Women is an excellent example of civil society response using economic empowerment to effect greater emancipation for women by fostering greater opportunities for women to thrive in business. Civil society initiatives need to involve community-based organizations and liaise usefully with public authorities at the national and local levels, as well as with private sector partners, allowing the mobilization of financial and material resources via both sponsorship and investments. The know-how and the networks needed to ensure the commercial success of women-owned and led businesses. Tomorrow's Youth Organization is also an excellent example of how mobilizing local gender resources and international support can make a difference, such as in the project of fostering women enterprises in Palestine, Nablus. In the Arab world, it is certainly about tapping the reservoir of human resources, whereby girls have been performing increasingly well, in countries of the Gulf actually outperforming the male academic body, in order to translate the gains of education into economic empowerment. In some Arab societies, using various forms of Islamic legislation, one issue even at the upper echelon of society, which has been a continuing problem, is that of inheritance. Well beyond the problem of 1/3, 2/3 disadvantage of female-to-male ratio in wealth transmission, for instance, examples abound in the Gulf, even in very comfortable socioeconomic layers of society where beyond the quantitative distribution, administrative control gives the qualitative advantage to assets transmission for males at the expense of females. In some cases, business legislation subordinates a number of legal acts needed by a woman to accomplish business imperatives to the whim of her tutor, husband, father, or brother, including in some countries concerning the freedom to travel freely. Algeria's infamous family code long had such an imperative for women citizens traveling internationally alone, in spite of continuing stride made by vibrant women's civil society organization to fight back against the restrictions to both human dignity and development. This often Wahhabi-inspired form of tutelage impeding women's empowerment has sometimes been accelerated by the reflux of immigrants from the Gulf in general and Saudi Arabia in particular, importing models of pseudo-success which has not inclusive of women's roles in economic sphere other than an exploitative mode. It's important that Arab societies look at women's economic empowerment both quantitatively and qualitatively if they are to improve the overall quantitative and qualitative strength of their overall development. And with this, I'll end my initial remarks. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I think we've had 5 great presentations, and I'd like to open up the conversation to all of you. I would like to go to Fida, though, first, and just ask her to revisit this notion. It's very interesting. The question of work or non-work, that it really does throw in a sort of conflicting variable on how that's read as empowerment, non-empowerment, enhancing, women's rights. And it raises the question for me, and it's just my own ignorance, are there good indexes that exist looking across the region on women's empowerment? And given, I think, a very insightful look at this, do you think that, how do they deal with that aspect? Now let's use into the mic because we're streaming live on the internet.
I have to say, honestly, that I find the term empowerment itself somewhat ambiguous. Mm-hmm. And so... well,
what term would you use?
Well, I mean, I was trying to think about that in my talk today. So I talked about things like economic security. Mm-hmm. I talked about things like quality of life, well-being. Mm-hmm. But I feel as if what empowerment implies is somehow women are overcoming gender inequality. And I don't know that necessarily that's as easily attainable through something like getting a job necessarily. And that's what sort of pushes me to thinking about, like, what are the conditions under which women are seeking work? What kinds of work are they seeking? I mean, is work itself necessarily empowering of women? If we take empowering as a term that we want to work with. And I guess I'm ending up using it. I mean, I started out sort of feeling like, well, what do we mean exactly by economic empowerment? And I tried to use terms like, feeling secure economically, and quality of life kinds of, because for sometimes quality of life is not about more work, but it's about a level of security, a sense of some future security, some leisure, which women all over the world have much less leisure than men because of the double burden of labor that they face, here in the U.S. included.
Well, thank you. And Nadara, your research data is really interesting to me, and it raises, because you make the case that there is a hidden story out there. I mean, there's the forgotten middle, but there's another hidden story that there's much more of a role for women's economic participation than is often seen. And one of my own, again, speaking as a guy born in Kansas but went to high school in Japan, we often talk about in Japan, not this crowd, but Article 9 in Japan being the no work laws. For me, the more interesting clause in the Japanese Constitution is Article 14, guaranteeing equal rights to women. Anyone who was raised in Japan knows that Japan does not have embedded equal rights for women, even though it's a constitutionally guaranteed right within the Japanese legal structure. It's just not supported or validated in any other way. And it has been interesting to me to watch over the years on my Japan side of my life, to watch whether that gap grows or increases. And here what's interesting is looking at the Middle East and also coming to a certain degree with the bias where you see also an embedded social constraint on women. Both, I mean, I think when you get to Nablus or you get to Palestine, you have lots of constraints. You have materials constraints, you have social and cultural constraints, you have state constraints, you have occupation constraints, and it looks pretty dismal. That's why I think the TYO story, when I talked to Cherie Blair last year at the Clinton Global Initiative, was just such an interesting story because it was this interesting moment of possibility. And I'm a Nixonian realist. We don't really believe in hope, but I kind of found that such an interesting side. But so if any of you have any, before I go to the audience, any interest or thoughts on things like in Japan, a formal declaration of rights that has very little value in real life versus a kind of ground up, if you will, I'm going to come back to empowerment or participation or, stakeholding that would be there. Amjad?
Well, I mean, we have the obvious constraints that we recognize, but those constraints are also time sensitive, right? They're not. It's not as if the Middle East is at its peak right now. I mean, even 30 years ago, some of the legal conditions, some of the legal provisions, some of the legal expectations and societal expectations were better than they are now. So there's been a decline in that. What's been fascinating is how women...
There's been a decline in societal expectations of women performing.
Right.
Or
the constraints placed on women's roles have increased. The expectations, both by men and women, that those roles are to be constrained have increased. But what's fascinating is how, I mean, nobody this isn't a static process, right? So women have continued to be engaged, right? They've continued to try to find ways of engaging, but how they've done that has been, I think, very entrepreneurial in a sense, not just entrepreneurial in a business sense, but even politically. They have found every avenue that they can in order to advance. And maybe I'm wrong, but I've gotten the sense that what there hasn't been has been a systematic approach.
Nell, have you had cases where you were training women or working with women who then became either rejected or had to pull out of the program because of family or cultural objections to what you and the Cherie Blair Foundation, others, the opportunities you were trying to connect them to?
I mean, I think there's a bit of a self-selection for that. So by the virtue of the fact that they got to being one of the 23 in our training program, their families were on board. That was something that we really looked for, was a certain pre-screening. So no, luckily we haven't had that. In fact, we've had quite lovely support from husbands and fathers and families in most cases, a few exceptions that we're trying to work with. But I wanted to pick up a little bit. I think we can maybe go to Hadil in the audience about how she felt empowered through our program. But just briefly, my perspective of it, I think there's two things. It's sort of providing the opportunity formally, but then second, encouraging the seizing of that opportunity is what I would see empowerment as. So the women we work with in Nablus have a lot of reasons not to shoot for the moon. I mean, not only are there systematic reasons why they can't reach the moon, there's a lot of things over a lot of time that sort of hold them back. And so what I see our role at TYO is first kind of a formal provision of a training program like what we've done, but then also just kind of the softer psychosocial, mental health, personal one-on-one time that we take to really say, well, you can do that. What do you need? You can do that. Why not try? Or, that. And I think that goes to the kind of Japan example of saying, okay, there's now this proliferation of microfinance. So technically the access is there. But if you don't have this kind of one-on-one, time-intensive personal development work, it's not a real opportunity.
Hadil, thoughts?
I agree with what Nell says, and if you go there, you will you will surprise to see all the women with their commitment, and you will surprise how their family also support them, and even girl who did not select it at the end, they also keep going. I think this opportunity or this project opened lots of opportunities for them. Lots of girls, they think to go, one of the girls, she went to Egypt to participate in another program, also to improve her skills also. This opportunity was so great for every woman there. You can find women from all around, Nablus villages, from all around the classes, and they all have the same concept and same goals to empower themselves.
Thank you. Samia Faruqi?
Yeah, I just want to. Is it on? I don't know.
It's on.
Probably I can. Oh,
yeah. We're streaming live to the world right now, so we're going to hear you.
I think economic empowerment is a highly complex term. And very often it's used in a very simplistic way, just meaning that a woman is able to generate income. And it's totally, I think, it's really misleading. Because the fact that a woman is able to generate income does not mean that she is really responsible for decision-making abilities. And that's what really totally empowers. I think in the context of her family, with a husband, with a father, I had the personal experience in being involved in a factory in Amman, Jordan, where it was, part of my interest in investing in women and sort of creating jobs. And it was the hardest thing I've ever been involved in, because all these women who were very diligent, hardworking people were totally unable to make decisions on even coming to work or not coming to work. The father would dictate that, the husband would dictate that. They would say that, oh, she's not coming because the mother is sick. So, I mean, total,
Did it work in the end?
In the end, it didn't.
That's
and
interesting.
it was very, very difficult. And it was really sad because they were very eager and excited to having jobs, but they were totally unable to make decisions. And that's what is lacking in economic empowerment, is really a whole total sort of areas of self-esteem, self-concept, understanding what it means, demanding. It's your responsibility to demand a role in, what goes on. So I think I really agree with the presentations have been excellent, and they touched on all aspects of women empowerment, and I hope we will engage in more of these and will definitely achieve
I promise
women
we will.
empowerment. Thank you.
Cherie, I know your voice is gone, but would you like to make a comment? Cherie Blair?
Yeah, forgive me if I sound a bit husky.
I've been that way too today.
Yeah.
So.
I'd like to respond, I think, on three levels. Perhaps a general point, first of all. This whole question of, that you pointed out before, about women succeeding in education, women's health getting better, and yet still not succeeding in economic opportunities as opposed to economic participation even. And then above that, political power isn't just something in the Middle East or in Japan. It's something that happens in every country. It happens in Europe and it happens here. There's some deep-seated societal things going on here. And that leads me to my second point, which is one of those deep-seated societal things is about men. And whatever you do, you find that men have been used to being the ones who get the opportunities. And as soon as women start seriously challenging that by taking away those opportunities, men feel threatened and they tend to take counter action. We saw that in political life in my own country when my husband introduced all women shortlists for safe Labour seats before the 97 election, which did in fact result in Britain getting far more women MPs. But the process was challenged by men who said, well, hang on a minute, that seat was mine because I'm entitled to it. And now this upstart has come along, happens to be a woman, and it's not fair. It's in fact sex discrimination. And indeed the court ruled that it was until we changed the law again.
It helps when you can do that.
Yeah. It's helpful when you can do that. That's for sure. But you also see it, I think, when I've been to the Middle East, and you see these girls taking on really difficult courses like medicine and law, and you see the young men who in many places actually know that they don't have to work that hard to get a job, because actually they'll be given a job just because they're men. Now, that's a bad thing for society too, because it's not about making sure that everybody puts in the effort that's required. And of course, if you're always told that you've got an entitlement, you don't really have to work for it, when that is challenged, your reaction is first of all to try and defend what you see as your right, which may be your privilege, and not actually to work harder to earn it. And I think that's why we do see this backlash. And it may actually be perhaps an explanation for why the young men who are educated are being more conservative, because they're educated with the girls, they see the girls are putting in the effort that they're not willing to put in and are doing well, and therefore they think the best thing to do about this is to assert their power over the women to stop them challenging them. I don't know, but it is certainly a possibility. Of course, I'm a lawyer, and I think the law has a part to play in this, but I do take your point about the constitution in Japan, and just because the law says this is going to happen doesn't necessarily mean that it changes. I think to tackle this, we do actually need to understand that women have particular needs, and that's why I think the project that we did with TYO is so important, because it's not good enough just to provide programs that are unisex, if you like. I think women actually do have specific needs, and those needs have to be addressed in the programs. I think the other thing that was why Nablus has been so successful is, as you said, I think that we actually try to buy in the community. You've got to get the community leaders involved, because they too can put pressure on the husbands, the fathers, and the brothers, and the sons, all of whom, for different reasons, may well feel threatened by women's progress. I'll end with, you mentioned South Africa, someone mentioned South Africa, and I remember myself, just before the South African Constitution came in, visiting there, and just before, when I first had the idea of trying to do something about women's empowerment, I'd actually been to South Africa, and then I'd gone to Palestine and met with women entrepreneurs. I spoke at a conference there. And the women in Palestine said to me that they could remember back in the 1980s when there was the anti-apartheid movement, there was a Palestinian liberation movement. And at that time, they all felt pretty equal, and that women were taking their part in that process. Yet 20 years on, 20 to 30 years on, women in South Africa, by all means, haven't achieved nirvana, but they are there in parliament, they are there in economic activity, they are held in respect legally. And women in Palestine have actually feel, and rightly feel, that things have gone backwards. And part of that, of course, is a reaction to all that's happened in the region, and goes back to identity, but it goes back to culture. But I think it also goes back to this thing that I pointed out before, that when men feel threatened, they do tend to react rather badly to it. Perhaps we all do. And so we have to find a way of involving men, of convincing them that this is not threatening, but it is actually in their interest, because if we don't do that, we're not going to succeed. Forgive the voice.
Cherie's comments about men feeling threatened was raised for me. I was in at the Al Jazeera Forum and had the opportunity to meet this will make some people uncomfortable, perhaps the former foreign minister of the Taliban. And I asked him, we did an interview, we got a young journalist to interview this person, and I made sure the question was asked about the views toward women and about political minorities and variety issues. It's on the internet, and it's interesting. And his response, which I think he was very honest, but it's a grim response, was, we're not opposed to resources for women or things happening for women. What we're opposed for is that those things happen before men get their piece of it. And you saw embedded in his response, whether it was true or not is another issue, but what you saw embedded in his response was men are the breadwinners, men take care of all of the issues, and until that world is settled, you can't put women in the game. And it was a very interesting question about threats. I want to open up to others on the floor, but when we do come back and as other people comment, I also want to come back to this question about TYO in Palestine, because we know the stories about the Taliban and women, but it's really interesting to me that there hasn't been any kind of rejectionism that has developed with what you're doing in Palestine. And I'd like to know why. I don't understand really the topography across the Middle East with these issues, but you see in some places really great horror, and I think there's been setbacks, but the fact is you're working in very tough camps, and to my knowledge, there haven't been many, if any, rough spots, which is surprising to me, and I'd like to know why. I think we're going to go in the very back. Is that Joanne?
Joe.
Emerson?
No, it's Joe Freeman.
Oh, Joe Freeman.
Yes, I'm a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, but more importantly, I've published several books on women in America, and I was one of the early organizers of the women's liberation movement in this country. When I was listening to you talk about the statistics of 30% of women are employed and how more educated women sometimes have a harder time, I was struck by the similarity of your description to what the situation was like for American women in the 50s and the 60s. I used to have this standard speech which started off that 1/3 of all women are employed and 1/3 of the labor force are women. It's still embedded in my head. What made the difference was not just education and economics, although that was important. That was a sine qua non. But what made the difference, what made it possible for us to completely transform the culture, was changing the cultural mindset in favor of equality and in particular of equal opportunity. And what made that possible in this country was the civil rights movement. It created the precedent. It created the mind frame into which we stepped and to which we were able to use very effectively. I suspect that there's something similar going on in South Africa, and which is why women have been able to move there, and that there's not something similar going on in the Middle East.
Thank you, Joe. Any comments, Peter?
I would just say that I've often seen the same parallels, and particularly with respect to the middle class. I was thinking about that today and thinking about the class nature of this and the way in which in the 50s and 60s the sort of sign of being middle class was the ability for the male to play that role of breadwinner and for the woman to be able to stay home comfortably and take care of her husband and her family. And thinking about, for young men in the Middle East, how in some respects that middle class status is very precarious. And this goes back to the trends that Nader was talking about. And so it's even, perhaps the idea of women as breadwinners is even more of a threat because men are unsure about their ability to fulfill their role as breadwinners. And men have very few options to think outside of that box in the Middle East. In some ways, the gendered expectations for men are much more rigid than they are for women, in that the man has no choice. He has to be the primary breadwinner. The woman can try and negotiate being both mother and have a career, but for the man, this is not out of, he can't even marry until he establishes a career, buys a home, and can prove himself to be a provider. And so the idea of sort of middle class being challenged by this. At the same time, there's an interesting sort of counter discourse in a place like Jordan. So on the one hand, men say they're opposed to women's work, but on the other hand, there is this discourse of men want to marry a muwaddafa, a public employee, because they're increasingly seeing this as necessary. So they have particular kinds of employed women that they want, but in economic terms, they're seeing this as increasingly necessary. But just to your point about not having a movement in the region, I think there are many movements in the region. I think women are working and struggling every day to create greater opportunities for themselves. It may not be on the scale of the civil rights movement that we had here, and it may not take a form that's entirely familiar, but it's amazing to me the change that's underway from day to day. I mean, even just the fact that women have far outnumbered and outperformed men in education in sort of dramatic ways in such a short period of time, even to the point of beyond even the standardized exams in schools. Someone in the Ministry of Planning tells me, well, in all of our civil service exams for engineers, 90% of the women are our top 90% of our top performers are female. I mean, women have made enormous strides in sort of outperforming males, and so how this sort of plays out in the next decade or two will be really interesting to watch.
I mean, it's really interesting because what was it last month? The cover story of the Atlantic Monthly. The title was "The End of Men," because on various statistical levels, there was parity achieved, but it was already being framed as the end of dominance per se, but in a way that is quite negative. I mean, well, I guess could be perceived to be negative. It's sort of interesting. Under siege. Yes, sir. Speaking of is that Salah?
That's right.
Yeah,
yes.
great.
Hi. Yes, I just wanted to quickly make a point as regards the remark on the parallel with the civil rights movement. Right. In the Arab world, my experience has been that actually this movement towards different forms of democratization, civil rights, and all that does exist. But it has not, post-independence very often, though I took the example of Algeria and all of that, it was that progressive side was apparent. And then there was a backlash. It was linked to all kinds of other issues through society, and notably the fact that the regimes that promoted that got discredited because they were not able to perform in bringing about sufficient types of welfare and other types of freedoms. And now there's been a bit of they've locked heads between fundamentalists and those regimes and those Arab ex-nationalist regimes, and so at the same time as the middle class has been squashed, all of that civil society discourse and all that has been muted, And what we've heard more is the fundamentalist backlash, and all of that has been more noisy, more spectacular, and also of greater interest internationally because of all kinds of other geostrategic and geopolitical issues. But I do think that there is a link, exactly like there was in America at the time, between those two movements, and that unfortunately has impacted sometimes negatively, women's development issues, because they've remained hostage to those other issues, that power struggle between those regimes hanging on, military regimes and others, and the fundamentalists also. So that discourse does exist, but it's less well organized, it's less obvious, and I think that the women's component is a reflection of the failures of the wider movement in that issue. So same thing, you've got a few poles of excellence and a few rays of hope, but then that's it.
Thank you very much. Okay. Right here, and then we'll go right over here, and then into the front. Yes, and this gentleman. We'll get all of it. Don't know if we're going to get much more beyond that, but we'll get all of you covered.
Hello.
Yes, right here.
Hi, my name's Elaine Rubin. I want us not to lose Amjad's comments about conflict. This month marks the 10th anniversary of a Security Council resolution, whose number I am momentarily forgetting, that called upon member states to include women's needs and women's participation in conflict resolution. I haven't noticed that happening much on the state actor level or in the peace process groupings who are now working, but it does happen on the ground. And women's work in nonviolent activities, in efforts towards peace in the region in many ways, do not get the kind of attention that they deserve, nor are there enough comments like the South African women's to that delegation about where are they. And I think that even for those of us who are not actively involved in these topics, it doesn't take much effort to comment on those absences when we have the opportunity.
Or to resurrect those great histories. So we'll come back. If I can, I'm going to cluster the comments. We can come back to everyone. But yes, thank you. And we had, there's so many. We're going to go right here. We'll do what we can. If I can ask for a little brevity, that would help. We'll get to everyone then.
Okay. My name is Margaret Williams. I worked with TYO this summer and last summer. And quickly, a point and then a question. The notion of the term empowerment, and it's vague and it's confusing and things like that. I've been thinking about that a lot actually, and a term that came up in my English classes this summer with the FWEN program was independence. So the women would just say, because we had a questionnaire, I asked them what they were doing, what they wanted, and they said, we want financial independence, personal independence, social impact, just that the power of choice. And it was just, with all of our educations and et cetera, we strive to find these words, and then you just ask them a simple question, and they give you a simple answer.
Good luck with that word.
Okay, fine. Yeah. But it was their word, and I thought that was really powerful. My kind of second thing is a question, getting to a couple points that have already been raised. This notion with kind of the women's struggle taking a backseat to something, right. And especially in the Palestinian context, this seems to be extremely prevalent, given the reality of occupation. So I just wanted to hear from some of the panelists what they have, kind of their experience in dealing with this, and how they see kind of means of getting around this kind of barrier to change because of the dilemma.
Thank you. Right here. We're going to bring you the microphone. I've got a mic person here that we can use. Okay, great.
Is it on? Yeah.
Yes.
I have two questions actually,
yes.
But I think they're small.
Ask the better one.
Can
or
I ask them
go
both?
with both,
I'm
but
curious.
make them fast. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I'm Hayat Asakati. I'm Moroccan, but from Holland, and I'm a student at SAIS at this point. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested in the informal sector where a lot of women work. And like you already said, that there are so many women that are working in this informal sector. And the reason why they get so low wages is because they are working in the informal sector and it's not formal, or else they would have got higher wages, I think. So how do we make sure that they come from informal workers to formal workers and organize them, and how we have it in Europe. You know, we have these unions and they get represented. So how are we going to
Thank you. This
come on that
gentleman
level?
here?
I have a second
Oh,
question,
okay, yes.
though.
Just make it fast. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
A second question is, there are a lot of rural development programs at this point, especially in Morocco, and I'm interested in how the role of women, what the exact role of women will be in these rural development programs. Yeah.
Thank you. This gentleman?
Hi, my name is Chris Maltoris, and actually I was on a Fulbright in Morocco working in rural development programs. And I was working with the UNESCO chair called Women's that dealt with water sanitation and women's empowerment. And one of the things that we found was a correlation between the degree to which women were empowered in local government structures and the availability of water and sanitation in these rural areas. And I think this gets to the point we're talking about operationalizing focus on women and economic development. And we talked a little bit about benchmarks and indicators, and I think the consensus is, especially achieve some of the Millennium Development Goals, we need to focus more on women's empowerment, women's issues, especially in rural areas, especially the poorest of the poor, who haven't been reached currently by the current development practices and policy. So then I guess the larger question then is, can we have effective development? Will we reach the Millennium Development Goals if we're talking about these larger societal issues?
Just a small question at the end of the program.
Do you see the potential for effective development occurring, or do we need kind of?
So what's the play? Is there a genuine playbook that makes sense?
Right.
I'm going to take this lady right in front of the camera, and I apologize. And we're going to have some drinks afterwards so that you can all talk with each other. But I went right in front of the camera. I don't know if it's her camera, but I'm guessing
It's
maybe.
not my camera, but I assure you
darn.
my hair blocked it.
Yeah, it was a good place to
My name is Hazami
You
Barmada.
might want to just step just to the left then if you are in fact.
I wasn't
Okay.
kidding. And I'm with the Arab Empowerment Initiative and Mubadara. And I wanted to ask you all a question. We are working actually on trying to engage the diaspora in filling the intellectual void that we see through the Arab world. You all have cited the issue, and we see it a lot, is the lack of intellectual and human capacity in the region, lack of money to actually bring this in. Consultants tend to charge a lot of money, but then there's also a growing disconnect between the people that are brought in and the communities that are receiving this type of aid and or infrastructure development. What role can the diaspora play? As we know, there's a wealth of knowledge and success in the diaspora, and what is the best ways to facilitate that type of programming?
Great, thank you so much. Now, if I can ask each, we'll start with Nell, if we can give quick snapshot answers as you see fit to the questions posed or any comments you have.
Sure. We like solutions at TYO, so I'll pick on your question and talk about a possible solution for the informal sector. I mean, I think that what we see with a lot of our women is that certainly registering a business and joining the formal sector may be the right answer, and so we're helping them to do that through legal aid and other things like that. But I think for a lot of the reasons we've talked about, it's not necessarily the end game to become a formal business. You know, for some of these women, it's about embroidering a few times a week in order to get a school uniform or food on the table. And so one of the things that will start in the second phase of our project is the use of mobile technology. I mean, the Blair Foundation just did an amazing, huge global report with GSMA, the International Sector Association of Mobile Phone Technology, and just came out with incredible statistics. It's on their website, so you can read it all there. And so just simple things like SMSs with the current price of a vegetable, or, you know, for some of our women, the market price of fish, or unfortunately, they can't fish in Nablus, but, you know, information about embroidery prices at the market or whatever. By cutting out that middleman and providing that information on their mobile handset, it's huge. You know, I mean, that makes a huge increase in what they can do for themselves and not be threatened by these nasty men who want to hold us down.
Great, thank
you. So, mobile phones.
Not at it.
Especially that one.
Right. Not at it.
Well, I think a lot of the solutions have already come up. I just wanted to maybe mention the role of the diaspora in this process, because I think that more than any other group in the world, they are the population of the Middle Eastern, and certainly at a very high level, it's very well represented, I think, across both, in Europe as well as in the Middle East. And I think that, when I compare that to, let's say, Far East, the Far East, I think that there's a great resource here. And if that resource could be used to precisely to maybe, establish scholarships, maybe establish other kinds of cross-fertilization, and it is happening. So it's not that this is a new idea, but I think that this is going to have an important, very, very critical impact, maybe in a few years, and to have that sort of expertise back in the region that as you mentioned, to fill the void, or if there is a void. Thank you.
Thank you. Amjad?
Well, I suspect that necessity is not only the mother of invention, but it's also the mother of social progress. When there's a necessity for change, when there's a necessity for liberation, women have always been involved. So Algeria, Palestine, Iran, the Iranian Revolution, everybody forgets women were part and parcel of the Iranian Revolution. They just weren't part and parcel of the gains of the Iranian Revolution. And I think what's happened in Palestine, to a certain extent, is that in the 80s the revolution still existed. And so women had to be part and parcel of it. Necessity demanded it. In the 1990s and in the 2000s, Palestine switched. They dropped the revolution part, but they never got the freedom part. And so they began the process that every Arab state and most states went into of taking back the women's equality part that women had been involved in, because there was already a retrenching, as you said, of gaining back, well, this is my role, we needed women before, but we don't need them now. And I think that a challenge not only for the diaspora, but a challenge for local communities in any country, in any society, women are necessary to progress, especially in times of revolution, in times of war, in times of surviving war. But we have no way of capturing the advances that are made during that period and institutionalizing them and enfranchising them afterwards. And I think that that's something that we could probably spend a lot more time on in terms of developing. I mean, it's a big deal for President Obama to say in the National Security Platform to say that that empowering women and providing women assistance is a major part of it's a strategic interest of the United States. That's a big deal for him to say. What does that mean? How can we actually establish policies? And the best place, I think, to start capturing what already exists is exactly in those social movements that exist during times of liberation or times of struggle.
Thank you. Doa.
To add to Amjad's comments and to try to answer the question about the rural areas in Morocco, I think that the structure of the society of the Middle East is a tribal society. So the role of the leadership is extremely important, and that's why what happened here in America cannot be applied in the Middle East, because here in the United States you can start by the individual. There you can't. It's the whole, it's the community. The whole family is extremely judgmental on the woman in anything that she would do. So the best thing in order to ensure that it will reach all part of any country or any society is the leadership. And the best example about that is President Bourguiba of Tunis. President Bourguiba of Tunis used to go on air 15 minutes every day to teach, women, men, and everyone about the basic hygienes, from brushing their teeth to how to treat your girl, how to treat your boy the same. And everyone was laughing at him. But look at Tunis now. They have the best numbers in everything in the Arab world. So I think that the leadership role plays a big and important role in how we can ensure that it will reach rural areas and reach everywhere in the Middle East.
Thank you so much. Final comments, Vida?
Yeah, just two quick comments, somewhat repetitive, but to the question about the informal sector. I don't think necessarily the informal sector is always lower wage than formal sector, because you do have women who are pretty significant entrepreneurs in an informal way. And I also, the idea of sort of unionizing these workers, I think sort of brings us to some of the larger issues about the lack of political freedoms in many of the countries in the region. So even former workers in most contexts don't have real unions or don't have the right to unionize. So, and this gets me, I mean, just thinking about sort of the larger issue of, like, it's a great thing that the United States sees women's empowerment as part of its foreign policy interests in the region, and I mean that sincerely, but we have to see that also in sort of a context of also promoting other kinds of freedoms and democracy in the region. So genuine support for other kinds of civil liberties in the region need to become part of what we're promoting genuinely in the region if our concern with women's rights is to be taken seriously. And just on the last point, on the role of the diaspora, I would just say that there are probably lots of folks like yourself in the region that I would try to engage and partner with, because I've had many young, bright folks in the region say to me, we feel like everybody always bypasses us and tries to bring some external expertise, and we have ideas too about what to do with our country. And these are young, pretty elite folks who feel bypassed by a lot of the processes aimed at developing their own country. So I would seek out more of those. Some of them even graduates from our own universities in the U.S., but feel sort of out of the loop once they go home because they're not Western consultants. So.
In my final comments, thank you so much to all of you for outstanding presentations and getting us beyond platitudes and thinking about models that might work or things that don't, because I do think, even in foreign policy or national security where I do so much work, I tend to be most easily attracted or drawn to playbooks or things where people can look at structural change and how to achieve them. We were talking about Joe's comments, and she really knows a lot about the civil rights movement in the United States. I did a series of colloquies with former U.S. senators, and one of these was Birch Bayh. Birch Bayh was a remarkable senator who was the guy who got Title IX education for women passed the United States, and he talks about this on tape, talks about the civil rights movement, and he gives you the it's remarkable how confident we feel now on some levels in the United States, but he gives you how close these battles were and how ferociously they were fought, and gives you a sense of the tension, and that's in this country. So when you extrapolate out, I remember working for Jeff Bingaman in the Senate, who was a Democrat. Many of his constituents tended to be single Hispanic women, head of households with 2 or 3 children with 2 or 3 jobs. I mean, that was the constituency in the state of New Mexico that they had to appeal to. And so to try to think about what a healthy community would look like in those people's lives and how to reach them, it may not be the same as exists in say, Palestine and Middle East, but it had its own dynamics that were very, very disruptive, convulsive, and hard to get your head around. And so I have huge respect for anyone in this field and know how hard it is. In closing, I want to thank Hani Masri and Tomorrow's Youth Organization, the Palestine Note. I want to thank Samia Farouki for pulling so many strings behind this to get here. Cherie Blair and Henrietta Kolb with the Cherie Blair Foundation for Women. And I want to thank Nell, Derek, Deba Voice. This is a really tough name panel. Deba Voice. I want to say Deba Voix, and she said, no, we're not French. Deba Voice, Nadira Chamlu, Amjad Atala, Doa Taha Brahimi, and Fida Adeli. Thank you very much. Let's have some fun in the back, so thank you very much.